What kind of empire accepts a child as a diplomatic gift, and then tells him to sleep under a man's feet? This isn't a metaphor. This isn't some lurid exaggeration from an old legend. This is documented history from the Ottoman court, where boys, some no older than 12, were offered to the Sultan not as servants or students, but as living furniture. Their official title? Yastikçibasi, the royal pillow bearers. But don't let the name fool you. These weren't children tucking a headrest under the Sultan's crown. These were boys who were trained, coerced, to lie silently beside his sleeping form, under his knees or behind his back, absorbing his weight, sharing his body heat, and not moving unless commanded. They were human pillows, breathing, blinking, terrified upholstery. And to understand why this ever made sense to anyone, you have to understand the palace that created them. The Topkapi Palace in Istanbul wasn't just a royal residence, it was an entire universe. Built in the 15th century, this sprawling compound was the seat of Ottoman power for nearly 400 years, housing sultans, queens, concubines, bureaucrats, bodyguards, and eunuchs, thousands of them. Inside its gilded gates, time bent, hierarchies twisted, and human bodies, especially young ones, became instruments of protocol, symbols of submission, and sometimes bedding. It's easy to focus on the harem. Western fantasies certainly have. But what gets left out of those Orientalist oil paintings of veils and cushions and mystery is the darker truth of children who were trafficked, gifted, or enslaved into the imperial court, and trained to behave like furniture if it pleased the Sultan. That brings us back to the boy. His name is lost, many were. But we know the role. He was 12, sent by a provincial governor, eager to curry favor. This wasn't unusual. In the Ottoman system, offering up tribute children to the Sultan was a form of political theater, part loyalty pledge, part bribe, and part twisted resume builder for ambitious families. The boy would have arrived in a silk robe 2 sizes too large, reeking of rosewater, with a scroll pinned to his chest bearing his patron's flowery introduction. He would have bowed low, not spoken unless asked, and then, if accepted, he would have been handed over to the Enderun, the palace school that trained male servants for every conceivable task, including the most silent, the most thankless, like being a pillow. His training would begin immediately. First, silence. Complete, unbroken, monk-like quiet. A pillow doesn't cry. A pillow doesn't speak. A pillow does not sigh, wince, or breathe too loud. Then, posture. The boys were taught how to curl their bodies just so, to support a sultan's spine without causing him discomfort, to remain perfectly still while pressed under imperial flesh. They were trained in breath control. Some held their breath for entire minutes, so as not to disturb a sultan's nap. Others were beaten if they twitched during a dream. One account from a 17th century servant recalls a boy being slapped across the face for letting out a sneeze during Ramadan. The Sultan was fasting. Noise irritated him. The boy's nose broke. You see, this wasn't just about servitude. This was symbolism. In a world where the Sultan was Allah's shadow on earth, everything had to signal his superiority, including the comfort of his sleep. The idea that a human child would humble himself to such a degree as to become part of the Sultan's rest was meant to showcase ultimate loyalty. It was body politics, rendered in flesh. And make no mistake, the Sultan was aware. These boys were chosen for their beauty, pliability, obedience. Some were used once and discarded. Others became permanent fixtures. A few rose in favor, if they were especially docile or useful. But not all of them made it, and not because they were dismissed, because they couldn't bear it. One 18th century Ottoman court document describes a boy found dead beneath the Sultan's bed platform. He had suffocated. No one noticed for hours. When they finally pulled him out, his arms were bruised, his ribs broken, his spine bent into an impossible curve. His body was quietly removed. His name was never written down. Because you don't memorialize a pillow, and yet some of these boys did survive, and in some rare cases they found ways to rise. The Enderun was a paradox. It could crush boys, or elevate them. If a child was clever, submissive, and stunningly lucky, he could climb through the palace ranks. Some former pillow boys eventually became chamberlains, harem guards, or secretaries. A few became eunuchs and gained serious political power, ironically, after being mutilated. But for most, the body remained the site of loyalty. the instrument of service, a soft object in the shape of a human being, and at night, when the palace lanterns were dimmed and the marble floors cooled beneath bare feet, these boys would curl at the edge of the Sultan's bed, not quite human, not quite furniture, and prepare themselves to be used. Silently, by the time the boy learned to sleep without dreams, he also learned how to walk without sound. Inside the Topkapi Palace, silence was more than etiquette. It was armor, a way to disappear without being removed. Every corridor could hide a whisper, and every whisper could become a sentence of promotion, punishment, or death, especially if you were a child who entered the palace through the gate of someone else's ambition. No one ever asked him what he wanted. That question had expired the moment he was handed over like a fruit basket, something ripe, unbruised, and expected to be sweet. And so, like thousands before him, the boy became part of a world where everyone wore a face that wasn't quite theirs. It was a palace of masks. Even the floor plan lied. The Topkapi Palace wasn't arranged for beauty. It was a system of control. 4 massive courtyards separated by towering gates and walls, each layer peeling back the power structure like an onion. The deeper you went, the fewer people were allowed to follow. The 4th courtyard, where the Sultan slept, was off limits to nearly everyone, except of course to the boys trained to lie beneath his body, and the eunuchs who managed them. Which brings us to a cruel irony. The boys weren't alone. They were never alone. Every moment was supervised by the black eunuchs, castrated men brought to the palace from Africa, often enslaved as children themselves. Many had been mutilated before the age of 10, then trained for years to become the invisible machinery of the Ottoman court. They were servants, but also jailers, and sometimes protectors, because within the walls of the harem and the Sultan's bedchambers, there were no mothers, no sisters, no families, just the hierarchy of obedience, and those clever enough to navigate it. Some eunuchs saw themselves in the boys, others saw tools. Most saw both. They taught them how to behave, yes, but also how to not die, which sometimes meant bowing too low, staying too quiet, or smiling when your ribs ached from being used as a mattress. The system didn't reward strength. It rewarded stillness. Still, not every boy was docile. Not every one of them broke. Some adapted in different ways, through subtle rebellion, through performance. They learned when to cry and when to pretend they didn't have tear ducts at all. They memorized the patterns of footsteps, which click of a slipper meant danger, which heavy tread meant an officer in a mood. They learned to anticipate moods like weather. They became experts in human barometers, and slowly, terrifyingly, they began to forget what it felt like to speak freely. One former servant who wrote anonymously in the 19th century recalled a boy who was punished for laughing during a mealtime. Just a giggle. He had watched a goose wobble into the kitchens and couldn't help himself. The kitchen master had him whipped, not for the laugh itself, but for reminding others what joy sounded like. Noise meant life, and life, in this palace, was a threat. There was an unofficial rule among the boys: don't make the Sultan remember your name. If he remembered, he might summon you again. If he summoned you, he might use you differently. If he used you differently, you might not survive it. But sometimes the Sultan didn't summon. He simply reached out in the night, half asleep, and expected a warm body to be there. One boy told another that he once held his breath for almost 4 minutes while being pressed under the Sultan's arm during a summer nap. His face turned purple. No one noticed. He lived, but after that, he stuttered for the rest of his life. And yet, this wasn't just abuse by one man. This was institutional. In some years, entire teams of boys were assigned to rotate shifts under the Sultan's bed, like a duty roster. One group handled the afternoon nap, another, the post-dinner rest. There were boys assigned to his divan, his private pavilion, even the royal baths, where they held towels with their eyes downcast and their backs always turned. But none of them had a title more degrading than pillow. There's one mention in a mid-18th century record from a palace steward. He lists linens, perfumes, and other sleeping arrangements, including a line that reads, Yastichi koku klari, usi kizi no bet, biri hazirda. Pillow boys, 3 on rotation, 1 always ready. Always ready, that was the core of their role. Ready to serve, ready to kneel, ready to be forgotten. There were no farewell ceremonies when they were dismissed, no retirement letters, When they aged out of their usefulness, usually around 16 or 17, they were shuffled into lower ranks, or expelled, or sometimes absorbed into the palace staff as errand boys or scribes. If they were lucky. If not, they disappeared into the margins of the city, nameless, voiceless, too broken to begin again. But a few climbed. There are whispers of boys who went from pillow to page, from page to secretary, from secretary to Kislaragasi, chief of the black eunuchs, the single most powerful court official beneath the Sultan himself. It was rare, but not impossible, and those few survivors, they remembered everything. They remembered the tick of the Sultan's breath against their spine, the exact scent of the linen after a midday nap, the warmth of flesh that didn't belong to them, the silence they learned to live in, and the nights they spent pressed flat against royal skin, pretending to be nothing more than a cushion. They remembered because forgetting would have meant it had all been normal, and it wasn't. By his 3rd year in the palace, the boy had stopped asking questions. He learned that questions were like loose threads, tug one, and something unraveled, usually your own security, but curiosity didn't vanish. It just went underground, folded into observation. He noticed how certain boys disappeared after a particular visit from a dignitary, how one child's sudden silence meant an elevation, and another's meant a warning. He began to understand that the palace didn't operate on law, but on temperature. If the Sultan's mood ran cold, someone vanished. If it burned hot, someone else was elevated. Or punished. Sometimes both. And at the center of it all, always, was the body. Because in the Ottoman court, the Sultan's physical body was the state. His preferences shaped policy. His health shaped war. His sigh could shift trade agreements. His pleasure could spark marriages, or massacres, and that made his intimate attendants, including the pillow boys, dangerously close to power. Not because they had any, but because they might hear it. This is what made them both invisible and hunted. Imagine being 12, lying beneath the ruler of one of the largest empires on earth, and realizing that your survival depended not just on silence, but on selective memory. You could not forget the weight of his arm, but you also couldn't remember too clearly who he spoke to in his sleep. You had to absorb it like fabric, soft, compliant, never opinionated. One Ottoman chronicler wrote that a whisper heard in the Sultan's bedchamber can alter the fate of a province. And the boys? They were living, breathing furniture in that chamber. But furniture that listened. This is why the palace didn't just train them to be silent. It trained them to be interpreters of silence, of tone, of gesture. They were not allowed to speak, but they were expected to understand everything, and occasionally they were used for more than resting on. Some sultans, like Ibrahim I, later dubbed Ibrahim the Mad, blurred the boundaries entirely. Records from the 17th century suggest he used his bed attendants as test subjects for poisons, perfumes, and even new medical treatments. One scribe's note mentions the application of mercury ointment to the lower back of the sleeping child in an attempt to cure the melancholy of His Majesty. Whether it worked is unclear. Whether the boy survived, less so. But for all the horror, there were moments of bizarre intimacy. One eunuch, writing decades later under a pseudonym, recalled how a pillow boy once made the Sultan laugh during a fit of insomnia by imitating a bird he'd seen in the courtyard. The Sultan rewarded him with sugared almonds and a silk scarf. The boy was dead 2 weeks later, possibly due to palace intrigue. It was never simple. A joke might save you or doom you. A glance could be affection or treason. The skin you offered might be considered comfort or corruption, and yet the boys weren't entirely powerless. Occasionally a pillow boy became a favorite, not necessarily in the way we think today, but as someone the Sultan associated with calm, with sleep, with safety. That's what made them dangerous, because if a boy calmed the Sultan too well, other officials noticed. They worried, they whispered. If the Sultan napped more than usual, the Grand Vizier might blame the child. If he slept poorly, the boy might be whipped or removed. A favorite could be used as a scapegoat by political rivals. Several times in the 18th century, court records mention disruptions in the harem traced back to a specific child's influence. That influence didn't mean the boy had done anything, only that he had been noticed, and notice was fatal. There's a recorded case in 1711 when a pillow boy was strangled by the chief black eunuch under orders for disquieting the rest of His Majesty. The cause? A recurring nightmare not the boys, but the sultans. In that world, your dreams weren't even yours, they were his. But the system didn't care. The machine of the palace rolled on, oiled with whispers and warm bodies. The sultan changed, the pillow changed, the night went on. And outside those walls, the city breathed its own rhythm. Sometimes the boys were allowed out, to fetch a specific scent from the spice market, or accompany a eunuch on an errand. The first time he saw the Bosphorus glittering in sunlight, the boy we're following nearly wept, not because it was beautiful, but because it reminded him that air could move freely, that light could reflect, not just absorb. And once, only once, he heard someone in the streets laugh without fear. It startled him. He carried that sound like contraband in his chest for weeks. Inside the palace, he would later be punished for stepping too loudly. But he never told them that his ears were still ringing with freedom. The real tragedy wasn't the violence, it was the normalization of it. The system wasn't monstrous because it harmed boys. It was monstrous because it convinced them they were lucky. Lucky to be close to power. Lucky to be inside the palace. Lucky to be trusted with the Sultan's breath against their cheek. He was 17 when he stopped being a pillow. Too tall, they said. The Sultan had begun to grumble that the weight wasn't quite the same, that the boy didn't mold correctly under his spine anymore. It wasn't a punishment, just a quiet reshuffling of the palace machine. One day the eunuchs told him not to report to the chamber that evening. The next day someone else lay beneath the Sultan. It should have been a relief. But that night, when he slept on a mat in the corridor near the kitchens, he couldn't fall asleep. His body had forgotten how to lie down without flinching. For years, sleep had meant stillness, vigilance, waiting for the weight of breath, the sound of a page turning in the dark, or the twitch of a dream that might mean a punishment. Now there was silence. He didn't know what to do with it. Boys like him didn't exactly have a next step. There were no promotions, no pensions. The court didn't reward loyalty, it outgrew it. Some were made attendants, messengers, servants to other eunuchs. A few were quietly sent away to provincial posts far from Istanbul, serving aging governors who had once kissed the Sultan's ring and now needed help remembering their own names. He was sent to the laundry. It might sound like a demotion, but within the palace, the laundry was one of the most information-rich environments. Because everything passed through there, the silks of the Grand Vizier, the undergarments of the concubines, the blood-stained towels from the surgeons, the scented bedclothes of the Sultan himself. Cloth doesn't lie, and unlike people, it doesn't try to forget. He learned to read it. A splash of dye could mean a secret message. A burned hem meant someone had slept near fire, in fear or punishment. A tear in the corner of a handkerchief sometimes meant tears on the face of a concubine. He didn't report these things, but he noticed, always. And once, very quietly, someone noticed that he noticed. The chief black eunuch, towering and terrifying, summoned him one day with no explanation. They sat in silence. Eventually the eunuch asked, "Do you still dream?" He didn't know how to answer. "No," he said. The eunuch nodded. "Good." A few weeks later he was reassigned again, this time to the Sultan's personal scent chamber. It was a room with no windows, filled with oils, dried flowers, resins, woods, musks. One wrong combination, and the whole place could explode. But if you knew what you were doing, you could change a man's mood in seconds. You could soothe his rage or stoke it, make him nostalgic or suspicious, all with a vial. It was alchemy of the senses, and the boy, no longer really a boy, understood bodies well enough to know how they responded to scent. Where to apply it, when, how warmth carried perfume better than cold. How memory attached to smell with hooks sharper than sight or sound. He didn't speak much, but his mixtures began to attract attention. One night the Sultan asked who had prepared his sleep balm. "It reminded me of my mother," he said. No one corrected him. His mother had died before he was born. But the scent worked. He slept. And so, slowly, the boy re-entered the palace's inner orbit. Not as a body, but as an influence. He was never again touched. Never again ordered to lie beneath anyone. But people began to defer to him when it came to what cloth the Sultan wore in winter, what oil to apply to aching joints, what perfume to burn before political meetings. He was never named, never thanked, never acknowledged in official records. But he lingered quietly in the Sultan's comfort. It was perhaps the most dangerous position of all, because influence without visibility is fragile. One bad scent, one poorly timed blend, and he would be gone, replaced, forgotten. Still, he remained, for years until the Sultan died. They say his heart gave out during prayer, or possibly while napping. Either way, it was the end of an era, and with it, the end of 1,000 little lives arranged around one man's breath. The new Sultan brought in new people, new pillows, new smells. The boy, now 30, was told his services were no longer required. He was given a robe, a coin purse, a scroll saying he had served the Ottoman court with dignity. He left through the same gates he had entered as a child. No one recognized him. No one remembered that he had once held the body of an empire in his arms, night after night, with all the quiet dignity of a piece of furniture trained not to feel. Outside the palace, the world was louder. He winced at the calls of market vendors, flinched at the sight of dogs. He didn't know how to buy food, or why people laughed in public. But he walked, and kept walking. Some say he died anonymously in the streets of Istanbul. Others claim he opened a scent shop, selling oils so calming they made grown men cry. A few believe he was buried with a silk scrap from the Sultan's bedding, hidden in his pocket like a relic. We don't know. But we do know this: the empire left no monument to boys like him. And yet, every empire, every palace, every war, every king, rested on their bodies, their stillness, their silence. Because no sultan ever truly ruled alone. He ruled while someone else held the weight of his dreams.